So, good evening, and thanks for joining me in cyberspace, as you can probably see. The idea really was to, reflecting upon what we did last week, although I think we covered some interesting ground, but it occurred to me that some of the things we did, I think we'd done possibly in the wrong order, and I want to go through the order a little bit differently. And what helps me is when I have the sources in front of me in a structured manner. So I've spent some time preparing them. So I've called it tonight, I've called it the paradoxes unboxed, the unpacking the different paradoxes as they relate to Tachlis Habriya, the purpose of creation. Last week, we went perhaps, I got a little bit carried away, we went perhaps a little bit fast, and we spoke about the idea, which is a problem we're still going to need to deal with in subsequent weeks, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu being perfect, lacking nothing, and therefore what was the state of his perfection prior to creation? And that is something we're going to have to revisit a little bit later down the line, but I think there are more elemental, more fundamental questions we need to ask. And so without any further ado, let's begin. Tonight we're going to look at the classic motivations for creation, and we'll uncover hopefully some interesting things which perhaps are not so intuitive or not so obvious. There we go. There. Okay, so this is the text. This is the Derech Hashem. Okay. Hinei. So Hatachlis Bibriya. This is the text. Hinei. Let's go through this very carefully. And this will be our springboard for developing into other areas. Hinei, I will read and translate. Hatachlis bibriya hoya lehetiv mituvoy yizbarach lezulasai. The purpose. Again, he's not allowing for multiplicity or complexity or within motivation of creation. And one could ask whether that is deliberate or he just genuinely believed that there is only one. The question is, must there be only one? And that's an interesting question. Again, I just want to mention it because according to some commentators, according to some of Farshim, it is in and of itself a question. But let's just shelve it for the second. The purpose of creation, says the Ramchal here, was lehetiv mituvoy yizbarach lezulasai, to bequeath, to bestow, to act, to give of his own goodness to an other. Ve'hinei tira, and behold, see, ki hu levado yizbarach shemoi hashleimus ha'amiti, he alone is perfection itself. Hamashulo mikol hachesronos, he is devoid of any defect. There is no other quality or category of completeness and perfection that is in any way comparable to his. V'nimtza. It therefore follows, shekol shleimus sheyiduma, any ersatz form of perfection, any type of perfection that can even possibly be conceived of, chutz mishleimuso yizbarach, outside of, other than, capital H, his perfection, by definition, it will not be total perfection. It will only be called perfection relative to something else that is deficient. It's all, once you're not talking about Hashem, it's all a question of relative deficiencies. That's all. Whereas when we use perfection as an absolute term, it only can ever mean Hashem. Absolute perfection, can only be HaKadosh Baruch Hu's perfection, in that it is innate and it is who and what he is. Therefore, given that his desire was to bestow goodness upon others, it would not have been good enough for him to give a little bit of goodness. And tonight I'm going to shelve this. We may come back to this. Given that the entire purpose was to give, well, then if you're trying to give, then it is common sense that you give the maximum that you can possibly give. Now, in this case, the giving is not limited by the giver. It is very much limited by the ability of the recipient to contain such goodness. And that is the way actually Hashem operates. He gives us capacities and says basically, the more you turn yourself into a receptacle that is able to receive bracha, that's how much I'll give you. And this is something that is very much worth bearing in mind. And he does add, there is a caveat. Of course, by definition, there is going to be a limit. It's the maximum goodness that a human, finite, mortal being can possibly receive. There's going to be a limitation. Given that he alone is true and ultimate goodness, Elo b'hiyosei mahana lezulosoi, b'toiv hahu atzmoi, shehu bo yizborach mitzad atzmoi, shu atoiv hasholem v'amiti. A convoluted sentence. Let me break it down and translate it. But it's really, and translated, it's actually really, really important. Again, tonight we're not going to go into it in depth. Given that HaKadosh, the whole purpose of creation was to give, it therefore follows that the quantity of giving will be the maximum, and also the quality. What is that which is innately good is Hashem. So in simple terms, it means that it would not be enough. Or the way he puts it interestingly is, his desire to give would not be satisfied unless he was able to give of that goodness, which is who and what he is, his own goodness, capital H. Because that, only that, is ultimate goodness. So some of that goodness will be that which he will give to us. Because anything less than that, to give us a Lamborghini, to give us a whatever, anything other than being granted a slice of ultimate goodness, is just to shortchange his own Rotzain. So given that he created a Rotzain, as we spoke about last week, he created a desire to give as much as he can, and to give, when we say as much, it is both in terms of quantity, that will be limited to some extent by definition, given that we are finite and mortal and human, and we are not God. He cannot give his entirety, he can't give himself, but he can give of himself, and we'll have to know, and this is the reason I included it in tonight, even though we're not going to go into it in depth, is because it actually is fundamental we need to reverse engineer this. It's going to be really important for us when we are decoding, we're unboxing here the paradoxes in terms of the motivation. So we need to be clear, even at this stage. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to give goodness, therefore he created. How much? As much as they can take. But what? What is that goodness? Well, he is that goodness. So he's going to give of himself, quote unquote, as much as they can receive. And that, in relatively simple terms, that is the motivation of creation according to the Derech Hashem. Interestingly, in Mesilas Yesharim, he puts it in far more simplistic terms, and I didn't think until afterwards to put it in, but he says the reason Hashem created was so that we should ultimately relish and luxuriate and delight in his presence in the world to come. This is the greatest possible delight. Again, it's in consonance with this idea. Let's move on. So far, so good, so basic. But, and okay, we won't make trouble quite yet. Reb Saadia Gaon, in his classic Emunas V'Deos. So really, the Ramchal We were talking sort of the 17th century. I'm now going to take you back. I'm going to take you back to Reb Sadigon. So we're going back many hundreds of years. And the reason I did this was, we'll come back to him a little bit later, that it is a bit more complex. We're going to see other things in Reb Sadigon a little bit later tonight. But I wanted to show you that this is something that is rooted classically in the Rishonim. And in another week, we will do some of the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim as well. But this is a good representative sample. Ki habayre yizbarach, says Reb Sadigon. Habayre yizbarach kiven shehizbarer shehu kadmoin, given that it has been clarified that he is primary. Lo yehoya imoy davar, there was nothing else with him. Hoisa briosai, therefore it follows, he says, Hoisa briosai lidvarim toiva v'chesed mimenu. It therefore follows that the creation was that there be goodness and kindness from him. And here, given that we understand, we find in the Sfarim, Hashem is both good and does good. I alluded to this a little bit last week. Toiv is the quality of goodness, and Meitiv is it in action. Remember, the whole concept of action is itself a creation. So we can get very entangled. But, as it says, Toiv Hashem lakol v'rachamov al kol masov utchilas hatovosei lebruim, and the first goodness was to creatures shechonanom hahavoya. The first goodness that he bestowed upon creatures was their very existence, that he created them. Ritzoni loymar, I mean to say, himtziu oisam, he brought them into existence, because prior to that, they just simply didn't exist. So he has said very simply and very clearly that the motivation for creation, very much like the Ramchal has said, it seems to be totally in line. So far, so simple, plain sailing, no? I'm afraid not. This is something that I quoted to you a little bit last week, but I wanted you to see it inside as well. Rabbeinu Tam in Sefer HaYosha. Very, very important. One has to believe that the Rabbeinu Shalom had no need for anything, no compulsion. Because any entity that is needy of something, that requires something, that means that they lack that thing. And only by acquiring or connecting or getting that thing, only then they become perfect. And we cannot say that, chas v'shalom, about the Rabbeinu Shalom. He has no need of anything. And given that he has no need for anything, nilmad mizeh, we can therefore deductively, inductively, we can work out logically, very simply, kihu loy bara elamoy l'tzorech. He did not create the world as a response to a need. Well, hold on a second. So if he didn't create it for a need, we therefore can know ki baroi nadava. He therefore, it was an act of altruism. It wasn't for him. By definition, it cannot be for him. It has to be for creation itself, even though that's circular, but that is the concept. Really interesting. Now here he does something. I want to point this out to you. The truth is, I could have done it in the previous quote, but I cropped it by a little bit by mistake. There's a posuk coming up over here, which we're going to use tonight as one of our sources. A Makoros, it's a very important posuk. I did mention it a bit last week. It's a posuk in Yeshaya. Kol hanikra b'shmi u'lechvoidi barasiv yitzartiv afasisiv. Anything that is called in my name, and we did go on a little bit last week about the difference between Hashem's name and essence, and in terms of nikra, azai melech shemoy nikra, and I'm not going to rehash that. But having said that, he tags along at the end something rather surprising and actually counterintuitive. And if you're sensitive to the text, you'll pick up and this is always the beauty of Torah. When one learns text, one has to do so very carefully, very sensitively, with a humility, with an appreciation of the greatness of those that wrote these texts. And when you're in that frame of mind, and I'm thankful to you because I hadn't seen this. I've learned this Rabbeinu Tam many times. I hadn't seen it, and it jumped off the page to me. Let's see whether you share my enthusiasm. So he's just laid down that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had no need to create. He lacked nothing. And therefore his creation was an act of altruism. Kasher Omar Yeshaya, in order to do good, ligmol tov lezoichim loy, to those who merit it. Do you hear the tension immediately? Let's stop there for a second. Let's just stop there. Even before we get to Yeshaya, which is itself a problem. Listen to this. It's a very simple question I want to ask you. If I wish to give a gift, if somebody wants to give a gift, nedova, ligmol, to give, that would appear to have nothing to do with the merit of the recipient. It's the exact opposite idea. Chesed is focusing on giving to you. It doesn't matter whether you deserve it. If I want to start asking, do you deserve it or not? That's the other end of the spectrum. That's din. That's judgment. That's justice, where we start and work out, does somebody deserve, do they merit? If Hashem is creating in order to give, and it's chesed, as we know, is giving and giving and giving, irrespective of the merit. But he does something here very, very important, very subtle, but we mustn't miss it. Look what he says. So now we know that Hashem created the world as an adava, as an act of altruism, ligmoil tov, to do good, lezoichim loy, to those who merit it. Is that not almost a definition, a contradiction in terms? It isn't, but it sets up a tension. And he's doing this deliberately. And then he finishes it off with the following proof text, which is going to be our first paradox of the evening. Kasher Omar Yeshaya, as Yeshaya Novi says, Hashem says, everything I created, bishmi, in my name, ulechvoidi barosiv. I created it for my glory. It jumps off the page. So it's almost as if it's a quote here of two halves, or 9/10 in the last 10th. He sets out his stall very convincingly, very logically. Hashem lacks nothing, he's perfect. He creates, therefore it has to be an act of giving. Olam chesed yiboneh is the other proof text, which he doesn't actually bring. And then he throws something in the tail. He says, to do good to those who merit it. As Yeshaya says, that everything Hashem created, he created for his glory. Surely, and that sets up we now have set up the stall for our first paradox of the evening. I put it in the heading of the slide here, to give or to take. But we've got to give this a bit of a twist. And I don't know if time will permit, but there's actually an incredibly important Purim angle here, if that's the right word. Let's see whether we manage to get to it. Covoid. Hashem created the world for his Covoid. Now, that word Covoid is an incredibly important word. It's very hard to try and translate it properly, but given that we are coming up to Parshas Mishpatim, and I heard from Reb Mordechai Miller, Zechon Levracha, and Gateshead, one of Reb Dessler's prime Talmidim, one of his primary Talmidim, that Rabbi Yisrael Salanta, his yortzeit was on Sunday, Chafei Shvat. And it always falls in Parshas Mishpatim, always. And the background to this is that Parshas Mishpatim is very much taken up with interpersonal, the halachas that regulate interpersonal conduct, damages, how we deal with other people, theft, etc. And Rabbi Yisrael Salanta was the one who introduced very much the learning of Musa, but he came at it from a particular angle. And although it's really a separate topic, but one of Rabbi Yisrael Salanta's primary Talmidim said very famously, he said that Darwin could never have postulated, leaving aside what he did and didn't actually postulate, it doesn't matter, but the concept that one way or another emanates from his writings, that man is somehow some sort of evolved primate, he says that could never have been countenanced. The real problem was he never saw a human being, a real Adam. He didn't see my Rebbe, he didn't see Rabbi Yisrael Salanta. If he would have seen the glory, the dignity, the majesty, the atzilus in Hebrew, of a godly creature in flesh, but somebody who represented the Covoid of Hashem. In fact, I think I've mentioned it in other shiurim, and David HaMelech refers to his own neshama in the first person. Ura Covoidi, arise, my glory. We are a creature that contains within us a little bit of whatever that means, but of divine Covoid. So Covoid is a key word. It does not mean arrogance. It doesn't mean status. It means dignity and majesty and grandeur, as it applies to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who is Melech HaKovoid. The only currency in Shamayim is that of dignity and glory, not being in any way base. And therefore he said that the idea was, this is what a human being is meant to be. So when I've set up the paradox, I've done it, instead of just saying giving and taking, it's more subtle than that, because primarily where the first paradox manifests, it's through the use of the word Covoid. And therefore, when we're going to resolve this paradox, it is precisely because the quality that we are looking at of divine Covoid, which then becomes personified and embodied in a human being, we are able then to resolve it. I'm just setting it out. I haven't told you what it is yet, but that was important. So what is this paradox? The classic sources we've seen until now all indicate that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world in order to give. We began to see a little bit of tension in Rabbeinu Tam, that there is a need perhaps to merit, and this posuk about Covoid. Now we will go to a Mishnah and a Zohar Kodesh. The Mishnah, and I could have quoted a Gemara in Yuma or a Gemara in Brochas, very similar sort of thing. Just a second, sorry, I'm just going to check with my notes here. The Mishnah says, everything HaKadosh Baruch Hu created in his world, he only created for his Covoid. And this is said in quite similar words in a Gemara in Yuma. Everything HaKadosh Baruch Hu created in the world, he created for his Covoid. Shenema, this pasuk. So here is our first paradox. Was the world created in order just to give, or was it created as a stage for HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Covoid? Shehakoil bara lichvoidai. As we say under the chuppah, the first bracha, everything was created for his Covoid. Which one is it? Let's shelve that paradox number one, and let's move on to a third contender in our competition for motivations for creation. And this comes from the Zohar Kodesh. Says the Zohar, after Hashem has created the visage of man, then he formed or called this an aspect of himself in this person. Why? Begin so that man should acquaint himself, become knowledgeable, to know something about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. B'chol midah umidah. So in other words, we have seichel, we have capacities for understanding. B'karakel, elikim, shakai, tzvokos, ekye. Why? Begin unlei, so that we should develop an awareness, an understanding at some level of who Hashem is, b'chol midah umidah, eichis nahig alma, how the world is run. So it may not be a midah in terms of his essence, because of course that's unknowable, but in terms of his interaction, fine, I get all of that. But still, how does this square? He interacts with us either with chesed or with din, reactive, depending on how we act. Because if Hashem's light would not be spread out over all of creation, how would we know him? And here again, the sting in the tail. Ve'eich yiskayim, and how therefore would this following posuk in Yeshaya be upheld? Maloi chol ha'oretz Covoid, his glory fills the earth. How on earth, asks the Zohar HaKodesh, could it be said that his glory fills the earth if the human beings on that earth have no handle, have no understanding, no capacity at all to grasp what is happening? So they get some sort of insight into Hashem. If they were not able to do so, then there would be no purpose to creation, because the purpose is Maloi chol ha'oretz Covoid, and therefore they are synonymous. I hope you're beginning to pick up again the subtleties here. Maloi chol ha'oretz Covoid, Hashem's glory is spread over the entire creation, but it's I don't want to make maybe it's not the time to be flippant or to be, but the joke goes, and it's not. I think quantum mechanics definitely has something to do with it, without question. But leaving that aside, the old joke: if a Jewish husband is alone in the forest and he does something wrong, his wife isn't there to see it. Is it still wrong? What he's saying here is that if there is no cognizant, conscious, intelligent being that is able to appreciate and understand, to gain an appreciation and an awareness of Hashem, then it cannot be said, his Covoid is not Maloi chol ha'oretz. And therefore, creation was so that we should develop and gain an appreciation and awareness and understanding of who Hashem is. So now we have a third contender. We have to give, we have to take, so to speak, for that Hashem should get Covoid. And now we have a third contender, which is so that we should gain an appreciation and awareness and understanding of who he is. Let's move on. The game is not over, because we have a fourth contender afoot. And this is our next slide, the Gemara in Shabbos. Omer Rabbi Yehuda, says Rabbi Yehuda, Lo bara HaKadosh Baruch Hu es olamai. HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not create his world. Elo kedei sheyiru milafonov. Only, very definitive, only that, so that people, we should fear him. Shenemar, as it says, V'ho Elokim asa sheyiru milafonov. So Shlomo HaMelech, HaKadosh Baruch Hu made everything that they should fear in front of him. So if Davari writes elsewhere, of course, as we know, the last pasuk, I once gave brochure on this. It's fascinating. If you know, according to many opinions, I've just mentioned this, although Shir HaShirim has aspects of being perhaps more noble, more lofty, more elevated. It's Kodesh Kodashim, as Rebbe Akiva said. But imagine if I told you, this is the way I like to frame it. People pay, how much do people pay at a fundraiser to sit on a table for half an hour and to bend the ear of Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or somebody? I don't know. People pay an absolute fortune. Imagine I told you that I could give you the sum total of the wisdom of the wisest man who ever lived at the end of his career, the end of his life. That's the way to frame it. What would that be worth? It's the last pasuk in Koheles. According to many Rishonim, Koheles was the last thing he wrote. And he writes, Koheles is such an enigmatic sefer, but he writes at the end, Soif Davar Hakol Mishra, the end of the matter. This is the finality. This is my last words of imparting wisdom at the end of my life. The Chochom Mikol Adam, Soif Davar, the final thing, Hakol Nishma, Es Ho'elokim Yirah, fear Hashem. Ve'es mitzvosov shemoir, and guard, preserve. He doesn't say do mitzvahs, he says guard, shomoir. Shomoir is always loisase. Ki zeh kol ha'odam, for this is all of man. Fascinating. Shir HaShirim very likely represents love. Shir HaShirim is the love song of the nation. Koheles finishes with a higher level. It has to be. It's the soif davar. Kim yura, fear. How can that be? More elevated than ahava. Kizeh kol ha'adam. This is it, guys. This is the final point. This is the most elevated point. And as we're seeing here on the screen, the Gemara in Shabbos, it's also in Koheles, but I was quoting to you the pasuk at the end. That's why he made it. And Shlomo HaMelech says at the end, Zeh kol ha'adam. This is it, guys. Nothing else. Now we have a fourth contender. So let's summarize. What do we have? We have the Ramchal, Reb Sadigon, and others who say, again, just so that I am clear, because I will put this up on YouTube. I'm not. This is I wouldn't say it's a basic shir. I hope not, but it's by no means exhaustive. I'm taking a representative sample of the sources from different mefarshim, but in broad terms, we have therefore as follows: we have Hashem creating in order to give. We have Hashem creating in order, so to speak, to take, so that Covoid should be given to him. We have Hashem creating so that begin the yishtamoida unle, as the Zohar HaKadosh says, so that people should develop an awareness and understanding of him. And now we have the Gemara that says Yirah Shamayim. So we have potentially a four-way heat. So let's see, how do we find our way forward? Okay? Weiter. Sorry, I couldn't find a good, I actually do have the Sefer at home as well, but this was just the one that I found. So please, I'm sorry, bear with me. The Reishis Chochmah begins to narrow it down just a little bit. Okay, so let's see. I'll read and translate it. So he says, Elo sheyiru milfonov va'oid. Furthermore, we're on the top line, about 4 words in, right? Va'oid shemachmas brias ha'olam. As a result of the creation of the world, nakir ma'asov v'godloi, we will recognize Hashem's actions and greatness, v'nira milfonov. And as a result, we will therefore have awe and humility. And do you realize what he's done here? Before we go any further, the first thing he's done is as follows. When the Gemara says Hashem created the world for fear, we know fear comes in 2 flavors. There is the very basic fear of retribution, fear of punishment. And then there is the much more lofty yiras horomimus, which means probably better translated as awe, a sense of the awesomeness and the greatness of Hashem. So the first thing he is doing here is he is laying down that Gemara that says that the purpose of creation is for yira doesn't mean the fear of punishment. It is the more noble, more lofty idea. Okay, so that's point number 1. So, and he has also put in the Zohar HaKadosh. What has he done? He said, the Zohar said, begin to yishtamoida unle, so that we should gain an appreciation of his greatness. That's true. But where does that lead you? That leads you, therefore, to an appreciation. That is the outcome. You use your brain to observe the world and its processes, and as a result, gain an understanding, as the Zohar says, of who and what he is. And the consequence and the outcome is, therefore, that noble, lofty form of fear. That's what he's done in the top sentence there. He's put those 2 together. I'll say it again. As a result of the creation of the world, we will recognize and appreciate, gain an awareness of Hashem's actions and greatness, and we will therefore fear him. He quotes the Zohar. And this is what the Raya Mehem, this is what the Zohar means, that the purpose of creation was so that we should recognize and appreciate him. Im kain hayira, therefore the yira that is generated, shehu yorei mei habayre shabara hakoil, the fear therefore that is generated of the Creator who created everything, who ikka is the main thing. V'zehu ikar hachochma. This is the ikar hachochma. This is the main thing. So we've managed to some extent to take 2 of them and get them to overlap a little bit. Okay, but we are not out of the woods. And although I hesitated a little bit about putting this in, but here's an Arizal from the beginning of Shara Klolim. It's very basic. And he says, let's see if we can work out what he's doing over here. He's doing an incredible, incredible thing. Okay? Just a second, please. Yeah, let's read and translate this. When he generated this desire to create the world, in order to do good to those creations, and they will recognize his greatness, and they will merit. You see that word again? We saw it in Rabbeinu Tam. And they will merit lihiyos merkava lamalo. They will, such people. So he created them in order to do good, and that they recognize. He created them in such a way that they have this capacity. Yakiru gdulasai, they will recognize his goodness. V'yizku, as a result of which they will merit lihiyos merkava, to be literally a chariot. L'mayla lihidovik b'yizbarach, to cleave to Hakadosh Baruch Hu. See what he's done there? Again, very clearly, he's put in lehativ, the altruism, the doing, the good, and the recognition of his greatness, and also the word merit. So we're beginning, we're not quite there, but, and now here, let's go back to Reb Sadigon. We kind of started with him a little bit this evening. We quoted him earlier this evening when we said that he created the world to give. This is another quote from a slightly different place in his sefer. You can see exactly where it is, and I'll take you through this. V'hashenis. He says another motivation for creation. So it can be more than one, by the way, certainly according to him. V'hashenis. Sherotza b'zeh laharos hachochma ulegaloisa. He wanted to demonstrate chochma and to reveal it. As we say in Ashrei, lahoidia livnei ha'odom gvuroisov. Interesting. Let me just translate. In order to make known to people his gvura, his might. Interesting why he doesn't quote the end of the pasuk. U'chvoid hadar malchusai. That's also part of it. But here he says. So first one was, he said, we quoted it before, to give. Secondly, to show and reveal his chokhmah, which then he brings a posuk which he equates with gevura. That's an interesting point. But let's move on. V'hashlishis, and the third thing, rotza b'zeh eles habruim. He wanted their welfare, something that would be good for them, b'mashem and higamboy, so that he would lead them, v'ya'avduhu, and they would serve him. Kasher Omar ani Hashem Elokecha melamedcha lahoil madrichecha b'derech telech. I am Hashem your God, says Yeshaya. Melamedcha, I teach you. Lahoil, melamed lahoil, to help you. Madrichecha, I'm your madrich. B'derech telech, to show you which way. Ve'im yoyma, then he throws in an interesting thing at the end. Just by the way, I threw it in just really more for the interest than anything else. Ve'im yoyma, if you would say Lama loy bram kodem azman hazeh, so why didn't he create them earlier? Hello, where have you been till now? Noimar, we will say, there was no time that you can ask such a question. It says it very clearly. V'oid, that's number one. V'oid, ki zeh derech kol ba'al bechira. He says this is intrinsic, this is innate to bechira. Sheyaseh b'chol eis sheyirtzeh. If you are a real Baal Bechira, then you can do something, you can do things whenever you want. That's the whole point of having Bechira. So you can do things whenever you like. And I'm in competition here with the answering machine. I hope you can't hear it. I have no clue what it is. Let's go on. And finally, almost finally, not quite, here we have a beautiful idea. Can you actually hear me? Is it, yes, you can hear me. Good, excellent. From the Siddur Hagra, the Vilna Gaon, and his son, Rebbe Avram, brings an idea he heard from his father, which is one of my favorite ideas. It's a beautiful idea. And here he really begins to square this particular circle. And this is the key to all the bits beginning to fall into place, at least. We say every day in davening, in the bracha of Ma'oros, in the bracha after Baruch Hu, on the constellations, on the sun, the moon, in a beautiful piece there. Oh, I see it's come out wrong. Okay, toiv, that should be toiv. Toiv yotzar kovoid lishmoi. Unquote. Those 4 words, we say those 4 words. Let's just translate those words. Toiv, the good one, comma, yotzar kovoid lishmoi. He fashioned, he created. Now this should be, and if it was maths, this would be a new operator. It would be in brackets, kovoid lishmoi. Again, toiv, the good one, i.e. the Rabbeinu Shloim, in his capacity as being toiv, yotzar, he created a concept called kovoid lishmoi. This concept of being able to give him kovoid. Shomati me abamori hagon zatzal. Says Rabbi Avraham, I heard from my father, the Vilna Gaon. Al derech, on the basis of the posuk that we quoted before, we saw quoted in a number of the Rishonim, Kol hanikra b'shmi ulechvoidi barasiv. Everything, says Yeshaya, that was called in my name and for my glory, I created it. Ha'umnom shamayim u'shmei hashamayim lo yichalkeluhu. Verily, in truth, the heavens cannot contain him. Who roitze b'chovoid hashfolim shebe'olam hashofel. HaKadosh Baruch Hu generated this insane, and I say this in a respectful manner, it's the equivalent of, there is no mashal. We can't even begin to give a mashal, but occasionally, especially if I'm with younger students, I've used the following idea. You know, you can put up on the board, or you can bring up, they all know how big a blue whale is. Yes? So if I'm not mistaken, the largest mammal on the planet. And you see the immensity, the enormity of the biggest blue whale that ever lived. And then you scale down to an amoeba, a single protozoa, a single-celled organism, right? The tiniest microscopic, subatomic little particle. I don't know, today a lepton, a gluon, a boson, or whatever, something. And it is the most instant, and then you look at the scale between the two of them. And imagine the blue whale, out of its love for this amoeba, creates a structure and a framework whereby the amoeba can pay homage, can give Covoid to this blue whale. And that doesn't even begin to do justice, obviously. The gulf is much greater, but much more vast than anything we can possibly conceive of. But we need, occasionally we need to actually say it. It's insane in that sense. So who writes the Rabbeinu Shloim, we're looking at, in other words, he's flipping it round. Until now, the way we asked the question was, as if he's going to take. Yeah, he created Covoid Lishmoi to take. Really? How stupid, how arrogant. Not only he doesn't need it, it's almost it's an insult relative to his greatness. So he fashioned, he created something out of his desire to give. Who writes and he says, yes, mein Kind, I created this thing called Covoid Lishmoi to give, so he gets the Covoid of the lowliest Sheba'olam HaShofel. We are in the outermost arm of the lowest dimension of reality. We're in Olam HaAsiyah. We're in we are hanging on the one hand, we're hanging on to reality by the most slender of tendrils, I don't know. And yet, not the Malachim, not the Eifanim, not the Sorim, not the Olam HaTzilus, not the Olam, not all the Eifanim. I think a man, a woman of flesh and blood down in this Olam HaAsiyah. You cannot actually get further away. It's impossible. And yet we are the center point, the focus, and the purpose of it all, of anything other than him. It's incredible. So the Covoid Lishmoi and the Toiv are not a paradox. It is because he is Toiv. Therefore, Yotzar Covoid Lishmoi. He created a framework, a structure, whereby we, puny, insignificant, little things, are able in some way. And he says, I want your Torah, I want your mitzvahs. Of course I don't need them. I need nothing. I lack for nothing. And he lets us run the show in an incredible way. We now become the engine of all of reality. Allah nefesh hachayim, tnu oiz leilokim, give strength leilokim. He runs the world in a reaction, in a reactive manner, depending on our mitzvahs and our averos. It's incredible. He desires the honor of the lowliest creatures in the lowliest world, and all the celestial cosmic spheres, every devolution, every aspect and aspect of a process of creation, as his light and his kedusha is distilled and concentrated and morphs through different dimensions of existence and oilamos and partsufim and whatever, I don't know, all the way down. Why do they exist? And that's why we do it, by the way. That's why it's with the sun and the moon, because that's the only thing we can have any sort of appreciation of immensity. I used to have this conversation sometimes with teenagers, especially today, when we have a sense of the vastness of the universe. We're talking about the physical universe. We're not even getting started with another olam, with just the physical universe. What we know today about how unbelievably vast it is, trillions of galaxies. And you stop and you think about it, and it's all for us, for a tiny percentage. You only can reach two conclusions. You can only go along with Hawking and whoever, or Dawkins or whatever, and just say it's just totally senseless and makes no sense. Or the alternative, which we believe is the emes, because we have the revelation. But it therefore puts into relief, into sharp relief, and gives us scale and understanding of the incredible chesed that is the creation of Covoid Lishmai. That is the mechanism. It's the operating system so that we then achieve our toiv. And we'll come back to that. So and they give ma'or, the light, which is the metaphor, so that yitnu Covoid Lishmai, so that we should reciprocate and give Covoid to Hashem. V'zehu hatoiv she'in lemala mimenu. There is no greater toiv possibly other than sheyotzar Covoid Lishmai, that he created this very concept and this mechanism of Covoid Lishmai. V'zu heichocha shnia. And okay, let's move on. That is an incredible idea of the Vilna Gaon. Says the Shla Kodesh. And here we're beginning, all paths are beginning to converge pretty much in the same direction. V'tachlis habriya, says the Shla Kodesh, the tachlis of Bria hoysam me'itoi baruch hu, who came from him, blessed be he, benedova, voluntarily, as an altruism, betuvai hagodol, lehetiv lezulosai, to do good to the other, sheyakiru Elokusai Yisbarach, that they recognize his godliness. V'oz yehiyu dveikim boi b'hanitzchias, and then they will be connected to him and to eternity. And if you remember from a shir we gave a number of weeks ago, how distance creates the closeness. If you recall that, this is the idea. We just spoke about the distance, the gulf, the vast. And that's, by the way, of course, why we're going to come to Yira. You with me? The Hashem creates. Why does he create? There's only one reason why he creates. Nobody is arguing with that. Because to give. How does he give, and what does he give, and what is good? He is good. That means we have to connect to that goodness. How do we connect to that goodness? The only way we do it is by having the humility, the yira, is by appreciating who we are, who he is, our connection to him. And the more we do that and we turn ourselves into a keli for that, we become closer to him. And here is the real paradox, but we've resolved it in previous shiurim. It is through yira, through negative attributes. It is through yira, through just that recognition, just standing and contemplating the awesomeness, the vastness of the physical universe, the awesomeness of who Hashem is and that he created just in order to give. When we contemplate that and we have that yira and we want to try and know and understand, he gives us the brain and a neshama, the yishtamoidu unlay, that we can begin to understand and appreciate, then that very sense of awe and majesty, which in a sense is distance, is through the negative, through the yira. That's why Shlomo HaMelech says, Soif davar, after Shir HaShirim, after Ahava, Soif davar kol nishma eselikim yira. Just have this sense of awareness of who you are and know that he created that just for you. That is how you get closer. And then you are better because you are closer to the source of goodness by definition. And he has given you of the Tov. You've achieved an aspect of Tov as much as we can. That is the pathway. There are no contradictions. In essence, it's all one and the same. It's about appreciating. It looks confusing, and we're not finished by any means. I'm not even going to do this one tonight. We're going to leave this slide maybe for next time. It's another aspect in the Ramchal and Das Tunas later. But I hope we have at least, there should be enough food for thought and reflection of understanding how these different concepts, thank you, Nancy, that's very kind, how these different concepts all converge. There is much more subtlety, there is much more depth. I certainly don't know it all, but I thank you for the opportunity of allow me to reflect and bring up some of the sources and go through some of them with you together. Thank you so much, and to be continued. Hashem. Be well, everybody. Bleib gesund. Good night. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.